All right. Hi, everyone. I'm really super happy to be here because I've been meaning to come to Power to the Pixel literally since it began, and I've always been trapped in New York, unable to come, so it's a real privilege to be here. And I also just want to second what Sean said about this being such an exciting and infuriating time to be working in creating stories. It's something that I talk about a lot, that this really does keep me up at night, pretty much every night. In fact, the presentation you're about to see is basically Ingrid's brain at 4 a.m., so I'm sorry, but that's what you're getting. But I don't really want to be in a safer space right now. I think that I sort of think about it as being this liminal space, where you're sort of in the doorway and you're not quite sure, you're sort of half in the old room and you want to move into the new room and everything's a little bit difficult. And there's Leroy yelling in the background. But it is, in terms of the work that I do, which is really, at the moment, mostly around social issue documentary, interactive documentaries, it's so exciting and there are so many opportunities that I'm sort of just wading into the space, even when I don't know what I'm doing, and trying to be as honest about that as possible. So today I'm going to talk to you about looking under the hood. It kind of goes back a little bit to what Sean was talking about those buttons. I'm fascinated by those buttons, and one of the things that I'm particularly fascinated about is why those buttons? Can we have other kinds of buttons? Can we decide what buttons we want? And one of the things I'd really like to encourage you all to think about is just, how technology gets designed, who gets to design it, and then what happens when we hack it, what happens when we take it apart and put it back together a little bit differently. And then coming back to the idea around social issues, who gets to play with that technology, who gets to have that digital access? Because these are issues that I think sometimes don't get talked about that much, and to me it's really, really important, because I think what's happening now, especially with the prevalence of Android phones in the developing world, is that more and more people do have access to incredible technology. And so in terms of where our stories can go, it's an incredible time. Looking under the hood, for me, is not about the analogy, like if you're driving a car, don't you want to know how a car works? I don't think it's the same as that. I think it's more like, do you want to be the driver or do you want to be the passenger? And I think right now we should all be drivers. Like, it's, if we're driving along this road into this new world of storytelling, I think we want to be in the driver's seat. And so one of the things I'm going to talk about is how thinking about code and hacking can actually put you in the driving seat instead of being in the passenger seat, and how we can all do that even if you're really bad at maths and incredibly illogical like I am. Another thing that I think about a lot is this idea of the adjacent possible. This is something that Stephen Johnson talked about in his book, Where Good Ideas Come From. And it's this idea, originally, this idea that scientists could only invent certain things at a certain time, and that's why often scientists and inventors will come up with the same invention at exactly the same time. Because there's various things that need to be in place for that to happen. And then when you had someone like Babbage inventing, the computer, it was a little bit too early, and that's why it didn't take off then, and it took, another 100 years or so for computers to make their impact. I like to think about the adjacent possible for all of us. It's this idea of, if you want to go into a room over there, you sort of have to walk through a few other rooms to get there. But in terms of the possibilities right now with social media and with access, I think that I feel like there are more adjacent possibles than ever before, especially for storytelling. And I also like Johnson's idea of liquid networks, that we're all in these sort of loose liquid networks where we can kind of talk to people that we would never have had access to before, create stories with people that it would have been very difficult to collaborate with before. So what we did at the Tribeca Film Institute, where I work, is create this event called TFI Interactive at the Tribeca Film Festival last year. And this was kind of my way of creating a one-day conference of the adjacent possible. I'm really interested in not just having interactive storytellers and filmmakers talk about the space. I think what's really interesting is getting journalists who are looking at interactive storytelling, and designers and museum designers and game makers and education specialists to talk about what they're doing, because I think that there is a lot that we can learn from other industries. And I think more and more, we tend to talk a little bit within our own industry, and right now I don't think that that's that helpful. So at TFI Interactive, we started with a keynote from Baratunde Thurston, and then we just went through the day having all sorts of different kinds of people come and speak and network with each other. And it definitely created a whole new way of thinking for me, and I'm doing a lot more of that in the work at the Institute. And of course, it all does come back to the audience, the people formerly known as the audience. A lot of this work is about rethinking how we do create work for the audience, But as I'll talk about in a little while, it's also about how do we rethink that passive audience and actually think about how we can create work with them in a way that's not infuriating. Because obviously we've gone from this passive relationship to something more like this. I was going to try and actually design the devices, but my Photoshop skills are not that great. But this is the world we live in now, and I would like more of us to be the hacker down there. So Clay Shirky writes about this a lot, this idea that every time a new consumer joins this landscape, a new producer joins as well, because anything that you can consume with now, you can also produce with, like a phone. And this idea of buying a book and then throwing in the printing press for free is tremendously powerful. And I also love this quote. Brian Clark just posted this. Sorry, this is a really long slide.
Can you please slow down?
Sure. This is a very long slide, but I just love this idea of him basically acknowledging that we're all tying ourselves in knots all the time about this work that we do. I find myself doing this all the time, trying to describe the interactive documentary work that I do, and then I start trying to defend the terminology I'm using, and then I start showing one project, and then I jump to another project, and I love that he's saying that he's gonna choose to stop tying himself into knots over this, and that he chooses to follow in the footsteps of people who are incredibly interdisciplinary and reawaken people's sense of wonder. And I think it's this idea of reawakening people's sense of wonder that is the most exciting thing about this space that we're in right now. Because these tools, this technology that allows for this new kinds of storytelling enables us to make the most incredible things at the moment. And it's not just, it's not just the filmmakers and the storytellers, it's all of us who get to do that now. And I'll provide links to all of these, by the way, so that you can go and read further. But yes, it's this idea that these techniques, people can now experience anything and everything in all sorts of ways, and that we can work with artists, philosophers, scientists, and designers, mix things up, and create new kinds of work. So hacking culture and this idea of hacking. This is a really terrible thing that I did, but I did it myself. I'm not a coder. I created something that would make grass using processing with just those lines of code there on the right. So it really wasn't very much code at all. And I made a tool that makes grass, which to me still feels like this kind of miraculous thing. Now, yeah, you may argue that this is not the Aeneid, and I would agree with you. But I still think that this idea that we can say, Photoshop doesn't do what I want it to do, Final Cut isn't doing what I need it to do, I'm going to build a tool that does exactly what I want it to do, and all of us in this room can do that now, is very, very powerful. And that systems that are being developed, like processing, which is really designed for artists who want to code, are available now. And there's so much community support for these things. And we can all basically make graphs with, well, I don't know how many lines of code that is, like 6. Hackasaurus is another venture from Mozilla that I really love. It's basically encouraging kids to remix the web. Mozilla are really into this. Mozilla are the guys who make the Firefox browser. That's probably how they're best known. They're really into this idea that the web should not be used. It should also be made by all of us, and that we shouldn't just be passive users of things. So basically, it just gives a really simple tool for kids to hack websites, change the color, make websites do different kinds of things. But it's quite useful for adults as well, because it does get you used to that idea that those buttons don't have to be those buttons. They can be other kinds of buttons, and they can do other kinds of things, and we can control that. So out of this, this work that I've been doing and working with some of the projects, which I'll come to in a minute, we realized that we wanted to be involved in this active culture more at the Tribeca Film Institute, that it wasn't just about funding projects, it was also about encouraging this maker culture as much as we could. And one of the things that I really noticed when I started working in the space is that filmmakers didn't generally know any coders. Coders didn't often know any filmmakers. The designers, the coders, the filmmakers, the user experience people, none of them were mixing and none of them were talking to each other. And that if we were going to make all this awesome work and start to play in this new sandbox, we really had to get those kind of relationships happening. So we've just set up Tribeca Hacks. The first one is going to be in Cambridge, Massachusetts in November. And the idea here is that we'll partner with a different organization or a different group every time. and we'll just hack different kinds of things. So the first one was going to be with a group called Zeega, it's Zeega. They've created a really awesome HTML5 interactive editing system that you can all go and check out right now. So you can basically create interactive web-native stories using their software. So we're going to do a one-day event with them, and then in February we're going to do a couple of events in New York, one with Mozilla to explore their Popcorn plugin, which is a event-based system that allows you to play around with HTML5 video, and one with Games for Change, because we're also really interested in how games and documentaries can work together. And then we're going to do a whole bunch more around the country and hopefully internationally soon as well. But I'm very excited about doing much more of this, just really thinking quickly on our feet, trying things. If it doesn't work, we fail forward, and we just keep trying new ways of working as filmmakers, as storytellers. Oops. Another thing that I'm really fascinated by is this idea of the Internet of Things and connecting objects to the web. And then again, maker culture, which I think alongside of hacker culture, and this idea of unpacking things and not accepting the buttons. One of the projects that we funded this round actually is Lance Weiler's Leica's Adventure, which is where a robot is going to travel around the world, and kids from schools and actually out of school as well, can drive the robot around the world using their own imagination, doing problem solving. They can create their own robots as well to collect data. This is an Arduino, which I've sort of played around a little bit with. And it's just, it's really cheap. You can hack different circuits together, make it do really cool things. You can link it to processing. Now, you may say, well, that doesn't really sound like documentary storytelling. And I think some of this stuff maybe is a little bit outside of what I used to do when I worked at Channel 4 here. But I do think that I'm firmly sort of trying to position what I do in terms of the more pure documentary work in this culture, because I think it is all starting to fit together more and more, as Lance Weiler's project proves, right? Because we are a documentary fund, but we are funding robots in some ways. Another one that I love is this. This is the Raspberry Pi. They built a Raspberry Pi supercomputer using Lego, which I just think is like really cool. I think it's using 64 Raspberry Pis. And this is a MakerBot, which allows you to create your own objects. You can design them and then make them with your own replicator. I think it costs about $2,000 at the moment. And I'm sure the price will drop. So, not only can you create grass with code, you can also create your own, whatever that is, wheelie thing. And then this is super awesome Sylvia, who is I love her. She's a little bit of a hero of mine. She basically builds stuff and then creates videos showing you how to build them yourself. And she has lots of videos on YouTube. She has a huge following. And if you want to learn how to do a lot of this stuff, super awesome Sylvia, who's about 11 years old, can tell you how to do it. She's pretty super awesome. So, I've been thinking a lot about stories as software, but now I'm also thinking about stories as hardware. And, that's why, going back to this idea of the adjacent possible and what we did with TFI Interactive, that's why I'm interested in what journalists are doing and what designers are doing and what robot, engineers are doing. I think all of it is starting to influence the way we think about stories, because they're not words on a page anymore. They're not web-native stories even necessarily. They're not apps. They're not games. They're all of those things, and they're also robots traveling around the world. And when you start to think about that, I think it just becomes incredibly inspiring. And then, of course, all those issues that Sean talked about step in. Then it becomes about how do you control the narrative, how do you create craft, how do you bring all those things that we know about to this work. So I'm definitely not saying this is easy. I'm sort of saying more like this is the liminal space I'm in, and it's a challenge to all of us to make it work as artists. And then MOOCs, which are massive online open courses, are another thing that I've become very interested in recently. Because one of the things I realized when I started doing this work is how completely unqualified I was for so much of what I was doing. I couldn't code. I'm pretty web literate, but there were so many things I didn't know about. And I realized now I don't have to go to MIT to learn about it. I can go to Code Academy. I can go to Udemy. I can go to the Khan Academy. I can go to MITx. I can get all of these classes for free in my own time. So one of the things I started doing was this Code Year. I don't know if any of you have been doing this, but it's something that Code Academy developed this year challenging you to learn code, and every week they'll send you an email saying your next lesson's ready. You can collaborate with other people as you learn code. Now, when it comes to code, I'm not suggesting that all of you become coders. I'm not even suggesting that you need to know how to do basic code. I think it's more about an idea of embracing what code can do. It's not that you're going to go work for Google or Facebook. It's that when you start getting less afraid of code and you start thinking about stories of software and hardware, it just really opens up your digital palette as creators. And I think that's the thing that's really crucial to me. You're not going to necessarily become HTML5 developers or learn JavaScript fluently or any of that. But it does give you a new language to talk to the developers and the designers when you are building work with them. And I think it also makes you start to think creatively a little bit differently too, because you start to see the possibilities for what this code can do. So, I've had a few arguments with coders who are like, I don't understand why suddenly everyone is so obsessed with code. I mean, one obvious reason is it's the only jobs you can really get right now that pay. But I think it's more than that. It's not that I'm not thinking about creating coding engineers here. I'm thinking about creating people who think digitally about how they can create stories and how they can reach audiences in new ways. There's a great organization in New York called Kitchen Table Coders, and every month I think they just have 5 people. It's as many people as they can fit around their kitchen table, and they'll invite different kinds of people. Like they'll do one with dancers, they'll do one with fine artists, they'll do one with zoologists, whatever. And it's really about thinking about how code can plug into those worlds. And I think ventures like that are really kind of where we should be in the filmmaking community. We should be doing more stuff like that, more interdisciplinary collaborations where we get together with other people and say, what could we do? Either around the kitchen table in an afternoon or in a hackathon over a weekend. So the TFI New Media Fund is how this all began. And what I'm trying to do is now situate the work we're funding in all the stuff that I've just been talking about. So we're aware of the fact that with a lot of this work, there isn't that much funding out there. So we try and award we award more money to less projects so that we can really support them. So in addition to the $50,000 to $100,000 in finance that they get in grants, we also do a lot of peer-to-peer support. We get together on Google Hangouts at all the grantees so that they can talk about what they're working on, the problems they're facing. Do they need a coder? Can you recommend someone to do this? I've really been having problems with this. What do you think? And we also put them through labs. So it's really about the R&D for those projects. It's not just like, here's $100,000, off you go. With some of the creators, that's all they want, and that's fine. They're like, I know what I'm doing, I need the money, let me do it. But with a lot of them, it's been really helpful, I think, for them to have some guidance and to really be able to share this, because a lot of these filmmakers have never done projects like this before. They've never had to work with a coder. They've never had to think about user experience design before. It wasn't something they thought about when they were in the edit room for a 70-minute linear documentary. Suddenly, there's this whole world of like, what is user experience design? How does someone find out about my project on the web? Is it on an app? All these things that suddenly come to play. So we're very, very keen on building that out. And I think that's something, along with the hackathons, that I want to do more of, as well as more funding, obviously, because that's very important. So in terms of the sort of collaborative opportunities for the work we've been doing, I mean, one of the first ones we funded was 18 Days in Egypt, which was in our first round last year. And this was designed as a platform for people who witnessed the revolution in Egypt and were in Tahrir Square to tell their own stories. And it basically guided you through this platform that they built themselves. It's called GroupStream, to tell their own stories, and then also to invite friends and family who were there too to share stories with them. And I'll just play the video that sort of sets it all up.
أنا كنت هنا. أنا كنت غاضب. أنا مشيت هنا. أنا وعيلتي كنا هنا. أنا وولادي كنت هنا. أنا كنت فخور. أنا بالتحرير.
أنا وعيلتي كلها كنا هنا وفخورين جدا باللي عملوه الشباب المصريين. أنا كنت على الفيسبوك.
أنا كنت بصور.
أنا كنت بتويت.
أنا خدت صور موبايلي ونزلت.
ممكن نحكي قصتنا عن طريق إعلام.
I'm going to jump forward because it's skipping, but You can watch it on it's on the front page of the website. So this was really about how do you create channels for people to share the stories. Obviously, a lot of this was already on social media, but it was distributed. And as you know, a lot of you maybe who've tried to create stories on Twitter Note, that they don't necessarily get archived. So this was really like, how do you create an archive for these stories? How do you pull together the Facebook posts and the tweets and everything else? But the crucial thing that I don't think they thought about when they designed it, but that they definitely are doing now, is actually, it was also about digital access, because a lot of people who had the most incredible stories didn't, they weren't on their phones and they didn't have access to this technology. So what they ended up doing is actually creating fellows on the ground in Egypt who would go around and collect those stories. And I think about this a lot, because I think, one of the things that is wonderful about this new space is that it kind of gets away from this, Teju Cole called it the white savior industrial complex, which I think maybe is something that we can be a little bit guilty of in the documentary world. This idea of like, I'm going to go and make a film about this terrible thing that's happened and I'm going to change people's behavior. But there is something about that grand narrative that can be a little bit presumptive. And with a lot of this work, it's much more open-ended, which can get around that a little bit. The downside, however, is that the open-endedness of it can make it feel much, much less fulfilling for an audience. So I think, sometimes for people who want to understand what happened in Egypt, going through all these stories that have been collected can feel like really hard work. And actually what you want to do is go sit in a cinema, lean back, and watch a 70-minute film that guides you through a narrative. So that's definitely a challenge, and it's a huge challenge with a lot of the work that we're doing. And it's not to say, a lot of the interactive work that we're doing does have a beginning, a middle, and an end, absolutely. But I think with some of the more open-ended stuff, there's huge possibilities there, but the challenges are definitely there too in terms of audience enjoyment. This was another project that we just funded this year called New Day, New Standard. This is kind of interesting because there's no video, there's no film really in this project, and it's very much about digital access. This was about looking at America and thinking about the fact that, we make all these assumptions about digital access in other countries, but actually there's an awful lot of people in the States, in New York City, that don't have access to the internet, other than maybe going to their library. So this is a project that allows nannies, housekeepers, caregivers, anyone to find out about the Domestic Worker Bill of Rights, to find out about their rights by calling a number from a regular phone. And then there's also a radio show associated with it, because obviously, regular phones and radio are something that they do have access to. And this is something that we're going to build out a lot going forward. It's also something that I am very, very interested in, is like what can you do beyond bandwidth? And what happens when there are challenges to bandwidth. A project we funded last year, Dadaab Stories, is taking place in Dadaab in Kenya. And that's a massive problem. There's it's 500,000 people in the camp, and I think there's one internet station there. So it's definitely about not making assumptions about who can access what. And then another project that we've got involved with, because all of this is so much about collaboration for me, not just within Tribeca, but across other organizations, is it's called Living Docs. And it's a partnership between us, Mozilla, ITVS, BAVAC, these are organizations in the US, and the American University, the Center for Social Media. This is about sharing information around open source documentary projects that we're all working on. So if we have open source code, we can post it on GitHub and link to it on the Living Docs website. If we do hackathons together, we can create videos and share best practices. It's really about like when we do work that we think is interesting, when we have code to share, when we've done something that didn't work, we have a place where we can all talk about it so that the community can learn. Because I think there's an enormous amount of work happening in this space, but a lot of it doesn't get shared. So one organization will make a mistake, and then the next organization will go ahead and make the same mistake. And sometimes those mistakes are quite expensive. So we're really trying to share the load and share the information. Right, so this is a quote that someone actually said at TFI Interactive at the Tribeca Film Festival, and I keep thinking about this because I think this is where, despite the inherent challenges, this is where the opportunity is, this idea of involving people so that they understand. And when we're thinking about impact, when we're thinking about documentaries, when we're thinking about social change, this is so powerful. And I do think a lot about this idea of intrinsic versus instrumental value when I'm thinking about impact. It's not just about like change you can measure. It's also about like what is the intrinsic value of hacking culture? What is the intrinsic value of saying, I don't like those buttons. I want those buttons to look different. I think that's hugely powerful. So obviously we're looking at the instrumental stuff because the people who give us money want to know that. They want, people want to know the figures. But it's also, I think, about the intrinsic value of being able to hack stuff, of being able to make things. Hang on, I'm going to skip this because you know what so there's a lot of anxieties. You don't need to know them. I've spoken, all I do is speak about the anxieties. I want to do some positive stuff. So involve your audience in a meaningful way. Think about design and user experience. This is something that's very new for filmmakers who haven't really thought about that, unless it's like credit design. Experiment with new tools. Don't be scared. Learn to love code. You don't need to do code. You just need to learn to love it. Make the web. Don't just use it. That's really important. And keep creating, experimenting, and playing. Not everything has to be a final product. Remember that. You can do little experiments along the way. That's one of the great things about this. You can do them very cheaply, very quickly. And then if it works, you can build it into something else. But don't think about everything as being this like great 1-2 year adventure. Some things you can do in a weekend and just play. And then this, the creepy clown, which a lot of you hear. I showed this in the US and people are like, what? But I'm sure this is very familiar to a lot of you. I just keep thinking about this because this is all so new. I mean, in my lifetime, the TV would go off and we would have this ridiculous picture for 10 hours. It's all so new. So if you're feeling confused and you're not quite sure what you're doing and you think, oh my God, code, user experience design, it's okay because we're all in this, we're all here. We all lived with this clown, or most of us did. Get excited and make things, and please get in touch with me if you want any information about the fund. One other quick thing I should mention is the Tribeca Film Festival next year, we're going to show interactive projects, fiction, non-fiction, the works. For the first year, it's going to be a juried section in the festival. It's called Tribeca Storyscapes. We're now open for submission, so if you go to the Tribeca Film Festival website, you can submit. If you have any questions about it, I'm going to be programming it. Email me at icop@tribecafilminstitute.org, and I'm always on Twitter at FromTheHip. Thanks.